Okay, so my name is Maile Pahoa, and today I'm going to be talking about the status of women in prehistory. So the ability to provide basic necessities such as food and clothing is something most present-day countries take for granted. In the US, food is so readily available, even individuals without the means to monetarily acquire food can still manage to find sustenance at food banks, shelters, and even produce thrown out behind grocery stores. During the beginning of human evolution, however, stable food sources were not a practice, but rather hunting and gathering, which followed migratory patterns. The fundamental goals of these hunter-gatherer groups meant labor tasks assigned focused on the survival of the whole and included mutually beneficial, shared, and equal in value jobs. The need for more advanced technology to become more efficient hunters and gatherers eventually gave rise to the agricultural revolution, allowing smaller groups to focus in population, allowing smaller groups to grow in population and eventually take root in one location. The ability to become more sedentary changed how societies viewed the importance of the tasks provided by the sexes. Cultivation of crops meant less time was needed to gather, allowing for a focus on child rearing as societies further developed. This shifted the opportunities of social contributions and began the division of labor, as men couldn't raise the children and growing populations would have meant more emphasis on the domestic domain for one group and the public domain with its focus on social organization by another. The shift to sedentarization gradually changed the status of women in prehistory by changing the acquisition of fundamental necessities required by each society and its importance of contributions to the group. There is a common belief that the status of women in hunter-gatherer societies and the tasks assigned is based on biological differences from that of their male counterparts. This argument supports the traditional thoughts of the roles of women being confined to the domestic sphere and given tasks which allowed them to fulfill the role of mothers and still contribute to the group. Beldor and Baum explained the symbolic significance of artwork representing the status of women as previously suggested by the symbolism presented in the Venus figurines from the Upper Paleolithic period, demonstrating the significance of child rearing and highlighting the act of breastfeeding as one factor in the division of labor. Beldor and Baum argue that while breastfeeding requires time set aside away from group activities as well as carrying around small children, they also make clear that while ethnographic observations of hunter-gatherers do not universally support such an extreme position, there is nonetheless some evidence for a very large investment of time in child nurturing by women. Low fertility rates due to environmental and social influences would have also increased the need for women to raise young and the importance of the task. Although it is argued that raising children was not a full-time job, it would have meant an ever-increasing importance placed on the raising of children and the domestic sphere. While women were primary caretakers of the children, however, they still made contributions to the groups through the gathering and even participated in hunting and were participants in the decision-making process of the group. Contributions to the social organization of prehistoric societies is also evident in the religious artwork found in the archaeological sites, such as the southern Levantine site of Western Asia. Joffe, Dessel, and Halot describe a figurine found at the site as significant in the competing ideas of fertility and cult practices within a blossoming political structure. The Galat figurine is an iconographic representation of the religious system and the role women play in cult practices, and those effects on the political system by combining human characteristics with cult-like qualities in the art. In the publication, The Galat Women, Near Eastern Archaeology, Joffe, Dessel, and Halot explain how the nature of these power strategies, based fundamentally in shamanistic access to the supernatural and political, economic control of related symbols and materials, are key for understanding the evolutionary limitations of the Southern Levant compared to other regions. Based on the stylization of the Galat women, there is no indication the figure is a representation of a goddess, but rather depicts the body tattooing commonly found amongst the women of migratory Middle Eastern cultures. The tattooing is an important factor to consider when analyzing the status of women in the Levant because of the cross-cultural range of meaning it held. Tattooing among Southwestern Asia marked social status, served as a rite of passage into adulthood, and as Joffe, Dessel, and Halot also state, It was a magical practice, for example, to combat spells, to ward off the evil eye, or to strengthen an extremity, joint, or limb or muscle. The Venus statues in Galat women are both examples of the religious and spiritual associations between women and fertility, and emphasizes the importance of childbirth and lower fertility rates before the Neolithic Revolution. While there were some assigned gender roles in hunter-gatherer groups, there is also evidence of previously thought gender roles as shared tasks. For instance, in Aboriginal groups in Australia, new studies have shown that when testing the biological differences between the use of the atlatl, or the spear, there was little difference between the abilities of men and women, with the women proving to be just as capable and at times more qualified than the males. Grund, who conducted the study, explains that the use of the bow was more common amongst men, but because the atlatl was geared for larger game animals, the skills of the women in Aboriginal groups suggests that they could have participated in some hunting, and describes the atlatl as an equalizing weapon. Assigning different weaponry based on gender indicates women were seen as equals on some level, as they were permitted to hunt particularly large game animals, but Grund also indicates that there is little evidence to suggest that large game provided a majority of the food. Rather, hunting was seen as predominantly a man's task, particularly regarding smaller game, but women were allowed to contribute when it involved large game and the use of the spear. In this way, women were equal participants in the acquisition of food sources outside of the standard gatherer role. Leacock supports this idea of shared labor rather than a division of labor by exploring how in egalitarian societies, labor of necessity was shared between all able-bodied men and women. The importance of kinship in the structuring of the society, with an emphasis on the nuclear family and its ability to provide for the group, was paramount to the survival of the group. In Native American societies, many jobs were shared, but there was a division in social organization rather than labor, giving both men and women decision-making power in different aspects of the group. Brittle and Sargent also support this idea of shared tasks amongst genders when describing the invention of weaving. They argue that there is a lack of evidence of large game hunting during the Paleolithic era, but rather suggest an emphasis on weaving technology and the advantages of basketry and the ability to make clothing and other versatile tools. This emphasis on the shared ability to weave is still present in modern-day hunter-gatherer groups, such as the Pygmies of the Ituri Forest of the Congo region of Africa. Brittle and Sargent state that net hunting is a communal affair involving women, children, and elderly people, as well as adult males. And they explain how the creation of netting and other weaving tasks fall on both men and women because of the importance of providing a large amount of food in a short period of time. These shared labors are indicative of communal involvement found in group survival that is seen in egalitarian groups rather than the social hierarchy found in patriarchal societies. The Neolithic Revolution created a food surplus that began the division of classes and in turn affected the status of gender roles. While the roles of men and women varied in prehistory, both sexes held equal importance and shared contributions to the community. Before the Neolithic Revolution, the birth rate in hunter-gatherer societies were spaced out to roughly one child every 5 years with a maximum of 3 to 5 children in order to adapt to a shifting food supply. When examined from an energy input-output perspective, it makes sense for smaller hunter-gatherer groups to maintain smaller populations, as they would be constantly expending energy in the search for more food. Cicero and Tisdale explain how a food surplus allowed for a higher energy intake, effectively increasing birth rates due to the changed social status of women and to better childcare, combined with the larger and more regular availability of a more nutritious food supply, which forced women further into the domestic sphere. This also allowed the development of control over resources in order to maintain a surplus, and greater emphasis was established towards maintaining control of larger populations. The division of classes was established through an organized economic system based on resources that altered the value of women's status. While there is evidence that women held positions of power after the Neolithic Revolution, these positions were based on the status of men in their family or kin groups rather than their own merits. In civilizations such as the Incan culture, women held positions of power through religious beliefs and kin ties. However, they had no power of their own to claim as separate from a man other than from religious opportunities. The Neolithic Revolution also saw an increase in the number of children where societies began to sacrifice the quality of the children, having fewer healthy offspring in hunter-gatherer societies, for the quantity of offspring, as larger families meant a larger workforce, contributing to the advancing socioeconomic and political systems and furthering the class system and defined gender roles. While the agricultural revolution provided a sustainable food source, the ability to become more sedentary allowed for the domestic and public spheres to become delineated. Hansen, Jensen, and Skarsgård argue that societies with long histories of agriculture have stronger patriarchal values and beliefs that give rise to less equality in gender roles. Sustainable food production created a shift in tasks, resulting in higher populations based on supply, and created more work in child rearing for women. Having more children to raise meant less time gathering, and shrinking contributions to the group allowed a shift in the status of women. Lepowski supports this idea, explaining how horticultural societies such as the Venontenai are small enough that there is more opportunity for face-to-face interaction, influence, consensus, and resolution, and these factors can make for more egalitarian social relations overall. Less hierarchy, fewer specialized roles and positions based on age, sex, rank, and/or training, and a greater overlap between the kinship system and the political system. In Venontenai culture, gender roles exist but hold equal importance in the functioning of the whole social organization. As groups became more technologically advanced and population sizes grew, the need for social reorganization and restructuring gave men the ability to perform the necessary tasks, since women had to dedicate more time to raising the children and taking care of the domestic duties. Regardless, in many ancient civilizations, some women were still allowed to hold positions of power, whether through religious or political influence, but was largely based on social stratification or the class of women, as well as their gender. So here I just want to take a minute to talk about a Native American tribe, the Chippewayan, because I think it's important to note that it's more of a contemporary issue, where traditionally the tribe itself was a bilateral descent, so they were matrilocal, but they were patrilateral, so they preferred to marry into the father's side. One anthropologist he was the first one to study them, and he described the treatment of women within the Chippewayan tribe as being held in gross contempt and that they were often beaten. So they believe that it was probably highly exaggerated just because of the time of this study. However, current anthropological research does indicate that there was some symbolic devaluation of women within the culture. And after the 1960s, when you had the colonization had already occurred, and you saw a shrinking of the culture, there was also the number of women of young women within the tribe had dropped. And after that, then there was more value placed on women within the tribe. And so the women were treated better. If they were married, they were treated more delicately. And so I think that with the Chippewayan, you kind of see a shift from, instead of it being a survival of humans that you see in prehistory, after the Neolithic Revolution, it's more of survival of of a culture. Okay, so the ability to remain in one place rather than following a food source made life easier in terms of survival and opened the door for modern civilizations. However, it provided the necessary changes which saw the development of patriarchal societies where gender roles are assumed based on sex and women had less freedoms and equalities than in egalitarian societies. Sedentarization took away vital gathering tasks of women and placed majority of the emphasis on the raising of children and the home. While these roles were always primarily delegated to women, women also enjoyed equal status among men in hunter-gatherer societies, as many tasks were shared or considered equal in importance. Sedentarization took away the value of the contributions made by women and limited the roles performed by women, which gave them a status equal to men, eventually resulting in the dissipating influence of women within their societies. As women's influence waned and was relegated to the household, influence within the public sphere became paramount due to the necessity of social organization and its effects excuse me, on a food supply and growing populations. While throughout history the status of women has varied within different cultures, gender has required the role of women to remain in the domestic sphere, while the value of that sphere lost an integral level of importance as the Neolithic Revolution took hold. Increasing birth rates became the norm, requiring more women to take on household tasks and agricultural work to remain close to home for child rearing, while the organizing of civilizations, or the public sphere, became more associated with the work of males, leaving the status of women in the hands of a class system run by men. And that's the end of my presentation. So I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Thanks, Maile. I would like to give you a little bit. I didn't get to give you an introduction of Maile before she started her presentation, so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about her. She is working on her bachelor's in cultural anthropology, and she's been a massage therapist for 20 years, but also she is a member of the Women's Flat Track Roller Derby League, and she serves on the board of directors and is the training coordinator for the Junior League, and she skates on the league's charter team. She's got a very interesting life. Any questions for Maile? Any comments, questions? I did want to make one comment, and when you were talking about the increased birth rate of women after the adoption of agriculture, and the Neolithic, there was a study, and I can't recall who did it, but that indicated that not only was it more important to have more children for a bigger labor force in terms of agricultural lifestyle, but also that the agricultural diet, which is high in carbs, was more conducive to higher fertility rates.
I can see that.
Yeah.
I can see that because if you have a higher body fat percentage from the carbs, then you
And then there was other studies that showed that women athletes, who are training very hard, and I can't remember the term for it, but they're less likely to have menstrual cycles and therefore are less likely to become pregnant. And you see that
right.
in terms of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle where women...
right. You have to have a certain body fat percentage in order to have a menstrual cycle. So it's kind of like your body's way of, if you don't have the energy, it's not going to allow fertility because, and I have 3 children, so I could say this, they're kind of like parasites, right? So, you're sharing everything. So if you have nothing to share, your body's not gonna allow the process to take place.
Any other comments?
I had a kind of a question slash comment. I was writing in the comments, but I might as well just say it here. So excellent presentation, Maile.
Thank you.
One thing that I want to bring up, so as this change happened, for all these reasons that you outlined, you also saw this corresponding change is cultural norms that were then used to justify it. So we got just social acceptance, religious doctrine that was then shaped to justify male dominance over women and women relegation to the domestic sphere.
Yeah.
So these norms were influenced almost like a, it's like the material dialectics by Karl Marx, that you have the material conditions that then change norms.
Mm-hmm. That it makes sense, you know. Again, if you look at cultures like the Inca, and as I kind of was talking about before, like with the Chippewayan, you know, as the agricultural revolution kind of took root, the goal isn't survival of the human species at that point anymore. It's survival of the culture. It's survival of just the one group at that time. And so you have the Inca that, you know, they built these massive food silos around their empire, and that would have, you know, it was a way to show their influence. They were telling those other groups that they wanted to come into the fold, that they could provide the food, you know, but they had to be a part of their culture, you know. And I think if you want, when you're doing that and you have these stratified cultures, you know, you need people to fall in line, because there has to be some sort of organization. You know, food was basically the first form of money, right? And so it's just, like I say, it sends a very powerful message, and it's something that, you know, just starts to permeate all those other aspects of culture, because they need to maintain.
There was also a a study done on the San. People call them the Bushmen, but that's really not the term that they like to be called. But there was a large group of them that had been moved off of their traditional land, where they were hunters and gatherers, and they were forced to live on a reservation-like system, like the Native Americans were. And once that happened, women who previously had been, you know, it's a pretty egalitarian society, women were relegated to the domestic sphere, and the men were the ones that were going out and dealing with the outside world, so to speak. And women's status went way down, and actually the instances of domestic violence, alcoholism, and lots of other things skyrocketed among that group. So there seems to be correlation there.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, I don't think well, it's not uncommon for a lot of those tribes, you know, when you have, I don't want to say patriarchy forced onto them, but, you know, just Western culture itself. And so I think that was like, when I was reading up on the Chippewayan, I think that's the one thing that had kind of jumped out at me, and why I wanted to talk about it was because the way their social organization is set up, it is very flexible. It's they follow descent from both their mother and their father. You know, it's not, I guess, your standard Native American organization. And so I don't know if that, like, how much of a factor, I guess, that would have played in their value of women. But when you look at other cultures like the Cherokee that are matriarchal, matrilocal, you know, the women have equal status. They much like the Venatini, they had different tasks. They still had their gender roles, but they still had equal influence.